This is part 2 of the tutorial series on making a basic experiment in TUX. In part 1, we created a new Unity project and configured it to use TUX. In this section, we'll focus on defining the design of the experiment. We'll define our experiment's variables and leverage TUX's powerful combinatorics engine to create a set of trials for us. In TUX, the experimental design is configured inside a design file. So before, when we clicked on the script helper tool, it created a design file for us that's already linked up with our experiment. So if we look in our assets folder here, we have this design file that gives us a bunch of options to configure our experiment. And if we click on this game object that it created in our scene, we can see that it's already linked to that design file. If I click on it, you can see it's highlighted there. So when we click on the design file, there's a bunch of different settings. So at the top, there's randomization and repetition. So this is used to add repetitions into your experiment, so to repeat the entire experiment or to repeat trials of your experiment and so forth. So we'll come back to that later. But right now we have to define variables in our experiment. And so there's 3 types of variables. There's independent variables, dependent variables, and participant variables. Independent variables are variables that you want to manipulate in your experiment. So they'll usually be associated with some changes in the Unity scene. So the first thing we're going to define is the color of the object that we're going to present the users. So to adjust the color, we want to make a variable called color. So let's create a variable that's an independent variable, and we have to choose a type for the variable. So because colors, we're going to go by name. We're going to pick a string value. And so now we create the variable, and a variable editor will pop up. And we can hide this editor with this button here, but it will still give us the warnings that we're missing something. So if we tried to run right now, we'd get errors. So first we have to give the variable a name. So we'll name it color. And the spelling of these variables will be important later. And we have to define values for the color variable. So we'll call it red, blue, and green. Okay, let's see what that did. So down below, if we scroll down, there's a button called Preview Design. So before, when we tried to run the experiment, it said no trials defined. You probably didn't set up a design file. So now we've set up a design file. Even though it's very simple, this is enough to actually run an experiment. So if we preview the design, a new window will open up, and we can actually see now that our experiment has 3 trials. We have trials 0, 1, and 2, and it just goes through the different colors, red, blue, green. And these other columns are automatically added in by the system. You can turn these on or off if you like, using some advanced features, but these are usually helpful to see whether the trials were completed. This is good if you have to stop early, and you can see if any trials were skipped, and you can see how long it took for each trial to occur. So now that we have 3 trials in our experiment, we can run our experiment, and we shouldn't get any errors this time. So we'll click play. And again, we'll go to debug. When you hit start experiment, it expects to have all the output defined, and it's expecting it to be a real run through of the experiment. So when we're in development for an experiment, we always want to click debug. And it says starting experiment, starting block 0 of 1. Great. And we can see we have our 3 trials here, and we're on trial 1. And right now it's just waiting for a return key. This is the default trial. So if I hit return, I have to click up here. If I hit return, you can see that trial is now green. It took me 24 seconds to respond, and now we're on the next trial. And so I can just keep hitting the return key, and then we get to the end of the experiment. It says runner is ended, and down here in the console we can see experiment complete. So we have our first experiment. However, the experiment didn't do anything. It didn't present anything yet. So we'll be covering that in the future. But for now, we want to set up all of our variables that we'll need later. So let's exit play mode, and we'll go back to our variable view here. So now that we have our color variable set up, we're going to hide that settings, and we're going to add another variable. And we want to adjust the size of the object when it's presented. So we're going to create another independent variable, and this time it's going to be a number. And usually in Unity, when you have a number, especially things like size, time, distance, that type of variable, we want to use a float variable. So we'll create that, and we'll call this variable size as well. And now when we add values in, it's expecting a number. So the first time we'll make it 1 meter tall, 2 meters, and maybe 3 meters. Great. So now we have 3 values of our size variable, and if we look in here again, we have 3 values of our color variable. And so what's going to happen by default, since we have mixing type balanced selected, it's going to counterbalance all of these values so that the value 1 of size will be linked with every single possibility for color. The value 2 of size will be linked with every single possibility of color, and so on. So we're going to get 9 trials, hopefully. So if we go down to preview design, we can look here, and sure enough, we have trials 0 to 8, so that's 9 trials. And we can see that for every size value, so there's 1, we have red, 1 blue, 1 green. Size 2, red, blue, green, and size 3, red, blue, green. And just to double check that everything's working, we'll hit play again, debug, and we can see we have all 9 of our trials. And we can go through them still. Great. So right now we have our independent variables defined, but we need to also measure something in our experiment. And that's where dependent variables come in. So these are variables that we want to record during our experiment. And so let's create a dependent variable. And if you recall, the point of this experiment is to have the participant match the size of 2 objects. So we want to see how close they were in that matching. So we'll call this variable matched size. And because it's a size, we want it to be float. So we'll pick dependent float to be a number. And now under dependent variables, we have a new variable. I'm just going to hide these independent variables. Okay, so we'll name this new variable matched size. And we'll give it a default value of -999. And that's just helpful when you're looking at your data later to make sure that there's no missing data. And we also are interested in the participant's age and maybe their gender. So for that, we could measure it in a dependent variable, but then every single trial we'd have to write in which gender and which age they were. Participant variables behave a little bit differently. They're variables that are recorded at the start of an experiment session. So these variables will be the same for an entire session. And that just saves a lot of work later on. So let's create 2 participant variables, one for gender and one for age. So I'll create a participant variable, and gender we'll do a string, create variables, gender. And so now if it's just a string participant variable, we could just add in any text, but we want to confine it to a few values. So we'll constrain the values, and we'll define some possible values that it can have. So we'll call it male, female, and other. And so now when we get prompted to type in a participant's gender, we will only be able to choose between these 3 values. And then we have to do age. So that's going to be a number of float, and we'll make it a participant variable, And this time we just want to allow us to type anything in, so we won't constrain the values. Okay, let's look at what that looks like. So now when we hit play, we have two new fields right here. Let me zoom into that so we can see it better. So now, before we just had the file name and folder where we're outputting the output file, but now we have a new section called participant variables where we can enter in someone's age and we can choose a gender. And you can see that the gender is only restricted to the 3 values that we assigned before. Great, so that's all working. So another nice thing about this debug feature is it'll just type in kind of default values in here. And so you don't have to worry about typing in an age and a gender every time when you're just testing. Okay, so now that we have our variables defined, we're ready to start having our experiment actually do something in Unity. So right now when we loop through the experiment, if you look in the background, you can see this is kind of transparent. You can see the horizon in the background. We've defined these variables, but they aren't actually doing anything yet. You can see the horizon is just unchanged. So in the next tutorial, we're going to be adding some objects into our Unity scene and manipulating them using these values from the variables that we've just defined. Thanks again for watching.